From Austin, Alan Weisman. This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Hi, my name is Julie Burwald, and I'm a science writer who's based here in Austin. We're at the Texas Book Festival to discuss Countdown by Alan Weisman. I remember the first time I heard of Alan Weisman. My father told me about this great book he was reading. He said it followed the thought experiment of what our world would be like if humans suddenly vanished. He described the flooding of New York and the return of coyotes to Central Park. But I confess that I didn't buy the book, not then, anyway. And that's because Alan Weisman is one of those authors whose books seems like they are scary to pick up, and not just because of the heft. It's because Alan tackles content that most of us don't want to look at squarely in the face. Elizabeth Kolbert zeroed in on this in her recent New Yorker piece about Countdown. She quoted Thomas Malthus, who wrote about the threat of human overpopulation 200 years ago. Malthus said, "The most baleful mischiefs may be expected from the unmanly conduct of not daring to face truth because it is unpleasing." And this is Alan's gift to us, because when we do finally square our shoulders and pick up Alan's books, we find stunning wordsmithing, artful craftsmanship, and engrossing storytelling, all of which come together in an alchemy that seamlessly conveys complex content. We read writing so lyrical and so fluid that it softens the edges of reality so that we can dare to face the unpleasing truths. Alan's talents haven't gone unnoticed. His reporting has been heard on NPR, PRI, and APM. He's published in the New York Times, Atlantic Monthly, Vanity Fair, LA Times Magazine, Orion, and Audubon, my two favorites, Mother Jones, Discover, and several anthologies, including The Best American Science Writing. His previous book, The World Without Us, was an international bestseller and the winner of numerous prizes, including being a finalist for the National Book Critics Award, the Orion Award, the Rachel Carson Prize. It was named the top nonfiction book of 2007 by many magazines. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Alan Weisman. So first, will you set a context for us about Countdown?
Sure. Some of you, even if you don't know that previous book of mine, The World Without Us, all you need to know is that I really wrote it because I want a world with us. The idea there was to theoretically remove us from the planet, to show what nature would do when it's relieved of all the daily pressures that we heap on it. And it turns out that life is incredibly resilient, and it bounces back rather gloriously, undoing a lot of the damage that we've done with surprising swiftness, or burying what it can't undo, and even to the point of evolving new creatures to fill some of the niches that we have inadvertently emptied by extinguishing their members. What I hoped readers would come away with was thinking, wow, is there some way that we could add ourselves back to the picture of a healthy, restored planet? Only this time in harmony with it, as opposed to the mortal combat that we seem to be locked in right now. And the epilogue of that book was devoted to that topic, but I ran into something that I hadn't expected, and that was trying to quantify what our human presence and impact is. I discovered that by doing some long division on some large numbers that usually overwhelm our capacity to get them, that every 4 to 4.5 days we're adding 1 million people to the planet, which just did not seem like a sustainable figure. So at the end of The World Without Us, I left that on the table. Is there something that we should possibly do to try to manage our numbers, to try to take control of our impact on the rest of nature before it not only starts undermining more species, but undermines our own presence on this planet? It's an uncomfortable notion, of course. The thing that comes to most people's mind right away, including mine, was the Chinese one-child policy, which nearly everybody finds abhorrent, including most Chinese, where I spent quite a bit of time when I researched Countdown. It turned out, though, that readers were fascinated by this idea, that they said that, nobody is talking about population. Everybody wanted to talk to me about it. And finally, I realized that, A, there was so much interest, but also it's such a loaded topic. It gets heaped with, religion and all the other things that concern us about. In fact, not just religion. Each one of us is really uncomfortable with the idea of having to impose limits on ourselves, because like any other organism in nature, we're designed to make copies of ourselves. And the idea of not being somehow restricted just feels like an unnatural act. It's as opposed to doing what comes naturally. So I decided that as a journalist, I should try to investigate this as objectively as possible to try to determine how many people can fit on this planet safely. And it turned into be much more research than I bargained for. One of the reasons that this tome is hefty is that about the last 100 pages of it are bibliography in very small type, and the accompanying index. And ultimately, I went to 21 countries. Go ahead.
Yeah. I want to talk about some of those loaded parts of the book. There's two sort of elephants in this tent as we sit here in Texas. The first one is that just a couple hundred miles from where we sit, there's a place that you described in your first book, and here's what you said. One of the most monumental constructs that human beings have imposed on the planet's surface is in Houston. The industrial megaplex that begins on the east side and continues uninterrupted to the Gulf of Mexico 50 miles away is the largest concentration of petroleum refineries, petrochemical companies, and storage structures on Earth. So can you talk about connections between fossil fuels and population growth?
Well, to me, the connection between fossil fuel and population growth is that one of the reasons that we became so populous is directly related to fossil fuels. There's really only two things that have made population grow. Population always grows if more people are born than die. And for most of human history, that really didn't happen. I mean, unfortunately, most babies did not make it to their 5th birthday. I mean, if you can imagine the pain of our ancestors. Like every other organism, they used to make extra copies of themselves in hopes that some would survive. And human population grew very, very slowly because slightly more than 2 children on the average survived. Anything that's 2, it's 2 people replacing themselves, and population stays the same. But then in 1798, Edward Jenner developed a vaccine for smallpox, and that was followed then by more vaccines for more diseases, and then the origination of antiseptics, pasteurization of milk. A whole lot of medical advances occurred in the 19th century, and suddenly fewer infants were dying. Many fewer infants were dying. Many mothers were surviving childbirth, and people were living longer. So suddenly we became more populous. We actually moved above 1 billion people in the 19th century. But then in the 20th century, and here comes fossil fuels, it started just before World War I, where 2 German scientists, an engineer named Karl Bosch and a chemist named Fritz Haber, came up with a way to pull nitrogen out of the air and chemically slather it on the earth to fertilize plants. And the invention of artificial nitrogen fertilizer might not come to your mind even when you're thinking of inventions that have changed humankind, but it's probably the biggest invention in terms of what it has done to us, because it totally blew the lid off of what nature can do, how much plant life it can produce. And as a result, well, let's put it this way, 40% we would not be here without, 40% of the people on the planet would not be here without artificial nitrogen. It completely changed the amount of food that we could grow. However, it itself is derived from fossil fuels, and both as its feedstock and because it takes a lot of energy, a lot of fuel that you have to burn to make this stuff. And then when it degrades, it also turns into nitrous oxide, which after methane is our third most powerful greenhouse gas. So now we've got a situation on this planet where we are hooked into fossil fuels in more ways than one. You know, we're all addicted to energy. I'm talking to you through electricity right now. Everybody here's got a cell phone, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, every poor country that I went to for this book, they're urbanizing more and more, and they can, no matter how poor people are, somehow they got a cell phone too. It's their leapfrog technology, and the electricity may be pirated, but they're plugging in their charger every night, the same as you and me. So we're addicted to this stuff in terms of how we run our fascinating technical lives that we have now, with all the stuff that concentrated energy gives us. We're also addicted to it because we basically eat it. You know, fossil fuels is the basis of nearly half of our diet. And as a result, we have become much more numerous. Our population doubled in the 20th century, and then it doubled again because in the 1960s we came up with a green revolution that greatly increased the amount of grain that you can get per stalk. Now, a lot of you, since Julie quoted Liz Colbert quoting Malthus earlier, a lot of you have heard the term Malthusian used as a pejorative, as if, oh, you know, that discredits somebody for thinking, you know, because he's talking about Malthus. And many people are under the impression that Malthus, because he predicted that food production would never keep up with population production. And later, Paul and Ann Ehrlich, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb that many people have heard about, it's a book that sort of helped detonate the environmental movement worldwide, came out in 1968. That book predicted that widespread famines were about to set in for the reason that Malthus had talked about even before we were a billion. And therefore, when it turned out that because of the Green Revolution, that those famines did not take place, that these guys were disproved. This is, however, a very selective reading as to what actually went on. First of all, the founder of the Green Revolution who won the Nobel Peace Prize, his name was Norman Borlaug, and he was credited for saving more human lives than anyone in history. He knew the paradox of food, that the more food that you create, the more people then eat it, survive to have more people, and that food production actually is what pushes population. So you look at the two places where population, where the Green Revolution was first tried out, and India and Pakistan. India is now about to surpass China as the most populous nation on earth. Pakistan has got close to 190 million people in it today, and it's the size of Texas, which has 26 million. And by the middle of this century, if it keeps growing apace, it's going to have many more people than the United States, nearly 400 million people. It'll still be the size of Texas. They can't possibly employ everybody. Their economy can't keep up with this, so it's filled with underemployed, frustrated, angry young men, and I don't need to tell you what Pakistan is turning into. The place is out of control. In Norman Borlaug's acceptance speech, he did not gloat about the Green Revolution triumphing over Malthus. He said, we've bought ourselves a generation of time, but unless we solve population control, we are going to be completely overwhelmed by ourselves. And he spent the rest of his life on the board of population groups. So what compelled me to write this book really has to do with the fact that now so many of us are using so much energy that is derived from fossil fuels. We're packing our atmosphere with insulation, so to speak. It's heating up. That heat is being absorbed by the oceans, which are expanding, rising, and their chemistry is changing. They're moving more towards the carbonic acid side of the pH scale. And you know, talk to your oyster men down here on the coast, especially people who are culturing oysters, and they're really getting worried about the larva's capability of developing shells. This is all catching up with us, and I wrote the book because if we don't know how to slow down our carbon exports to the atmosphere soon enough to do something, we do know how to control the number of us who are demanding that carbon.
And that brings us, I think, to the other tough subject that's also another elephant in this tent, which is just a few months ago, there were big clashes over abortion rights and just up the street from us. And so I wonder if you might talk about the ways that abortion is viewed and legalized in different parts of the world as you travel to these different places.
Well, I don't spend a lot of time looking at abortion in this book, except for usually in the negative sense. I mentioned Pakistan. Abortion's illegal in Pakistan, so there's about 400,000 illegal abortions in Pakistan every year because inevitably, about half the pregnancies in the world are unintended pregnancies. And women are desperate, so they seek an abortion. Or, occasionally contraception fails on them, so they seek it as a backup. That figure was so astounding to me that I researched, so how many abortions happen worldwide? And it turns out that various demographic institutes have looked at this, and they come up with about 40 million. And because I'm not a numbers guy myself, I tell this story through stories. I found people all over the world whose own experiences or own studies sort of exemplify what we need to know. But that number really stood out to me because they have also calculated that if contraception were made available universally throughout the world and everybody could choose whether to use it or not, there'd be not 40 million but 14 million abortions in the world. Now that's still a lot of abortion, and I know anti-abortion people don't want any, but I've yet to see in the years since Roe v. Wade anybody come up with a way for saving us from 26 million abortions. So contraception is really the best anti-abortion antidote that we have.
One of the most interesting comparisons, I think, for me anyway, in your book, were the policies in Iran and in China. And so I wonder if you might just compare what you found in those two countries and how they relate to population growth.
Sure. I mentioned before that none of us like the idea of a one-child policy. I mean, nobody wants the government coming into our bedrooms and telling us what to do. And the Chinese one-child policy has been, of course, this huge test case to show us what some of the real pitfalls and excesses can be of extreme government intervention. But you do have to understand, I had to learn the context of that. China had just gone through, this was before the Green Revolution, they had just gone through one of the world's most horrific famine in history. Over 40 million people died of famine. And they needed to do something because their population was still growing very, very fast. There were so many Chinese. The one-child policy, probably if it hadn't been imposed when it was in 1980, there'd be 400 million more Chinese now. Now, it's become such an ingrained part of their culture, and particularly as more Chinese live in urban areas, they don't feel the need to have, you don't need a lot of farmhands when you're living in an apartment. So people tend to be satisfied with one or maybe two. There are various exceptions to the Chinese policy. But I also found many countries that had come up with non-coercive, totally voluntary alternatives to it that worked surprisingly well. And one of them is a place that's really surprising here in the United States because it happened in Iran, which was the last of the 21 countries I visited, because it took me a long time as an American to get in there. But the reason that I went was this. In 1979, they had the Islamic Revolution, and they were immediately attacked by Saddam Hussein because there's this oil-rich province on the border. He figured it was easy pickings because the Iranian new government was just busy organizing itself. Saddam Hussein then had the backing of NATO. He had sophisticated weaponry, even had the components for nerve gas. And all Iran had was bodies. So the Ayatollah Khomeini asked every woman in Iran who was fertile to do her patriotic duty and build a 20 million man army to fight off the invading Iraqis. And they held them to a stalemate for 8 years. But then following that, in the planning and budget office, they realized they were going to have a tremendous problem. Within 10 years, as all these kids who were born grew up and needed jobs, and they did not want to have happen to them what is happening in Pakistan right now. So they convinced the Ayatollah that they had to talk about family planning. But the Chinese policy had been going on for 10 years. The Persians did not feel that that was culturally acceptable to them, just as we wouldn't. So here's what they did. First of all, they told people you can have as many children as you want, but the only thing that was compulsory was premarital classes for every couple going to get married. Frankly, it's a good idea for anybody. Quakers do it here in the United States. And in those classes, among other things, you learn how much does it cost to raise, feed, clothe, educate a child. Second, a fatwa was issued saying there's nothing in the Quran that says if wisdom dictates you have the number of children you can responsibly care for, that you can't use any form of birth control, from condoms all the way up to a vasectomy or a tubal ligation. Third, they made that available everywhere in the country. I spoke to this wonderful OBGYN, a woman in Tehran, very devout Muslim woman, who talked about how they would ride horseback to the farthest villages with surgical teams, and later on in four-wheel drive and even helicopters, providing these services. And here's what's crucial. They asked women to stay in school, because a woman who's studying tends to defer her childbearing until her studies are done, and then she's got something interesting and useful to do and helpful economically to her family. She may want to be a mother, of course, but it's very hard to do all that stuff when you got 7 kids. So ultimately, Iran brought their fertility rate down to replacement, 2 people having an average of 2 kids a year faster than China. A totally voluntary program. Today, 60% of Iranian university students are female, and it continues on.
I can't believe the time has flown, but Alan has a reading he'd like to do. I found it one of the most beautiful parts of this book, and it'll take about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions.
Okay, and I just want to add one more thing before the reading, in case it doesn't come up in questions. This is technology we already have. It's not like coming up with magical zero-emission energy and suddenly we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, which are going to only go away gradually. This is something we already know how to do, and it's cheap. We could provide that universal birth control for everybody on Earth to choose if they want to use it for a little over $8 billion a year. That's less than we were spending a month in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is an affordable thing. So the portion I want to read for you from the book is a portion that deals with one of the other questions that I raise in this book. Not just how many people can fit on this planet without tipping it over, but how much nature do we have to preserve in order to have a safe ecosystem for ourselves. For centuries, the cultural fabric of Iran has been woven by Persian carpet makers. In Turkish rugs, each strand of yarn is knotted around 2 warp strands, but Persian rugs, that's 1 weft per each warp. They're twice as tight. The tightest still made today have 144 knots per square centimeter. A rug like that of wool from the bellies of spring lambs can take 2 people 8 years to finish. In Tehran's Carpet Museum hang old masterpieces created for royal families with 160 knots per centimeter, woven by girls with sharp eyes and tiny fingers. One fabulously complex floral pattern that measures 320 square feet took 3 people working 10 hours a day, 18 years to complete. The principal weaver was 17 when she started and 35 when it was finished. Now, as a biology student in the 1960s, Esmail Karom would stare at the rugs in the museum, such as one completed in 1416 that depicts the Tree of Life, a Zoroastrian symbol that predates Islam. Among its branches, he recognized turkeys, bustards, vultures, mynas, owls, doves, thrushes, flamingos, swallows, quail, parrots, ostriches, and partridges. Around the trunk crawled bears, turtles, alligators, beetles, centipedes, lions, and leopards. The depictions were so detailed that zoologists could determine each species. He was looking, Carome understood, at some creatures now extinct in his land. The eyes of ancient carpet weavers are how Iranian biologists today know what once lived there. Esmail Carome was the son of an Air Force pilot who, like his mother, was one of 12 children. As a boy, his father would take him riding in Hosh Yelag, a wildlife refuge whose name means good summer pasture, just south of the Caspian Sea. The grass there grew so tall that he'd have to stand on his horse's back to see where the stalks were moving to know which way to go. Hosh Yelag was then home to the largest population of cheetahs in Iran, and the sight of those fleet creatures thrilled him, so he resolved to become a naturalist. After graduating from the University of Shiraz, he became a field ornithologist with the Department of the Environment and traveled to every ecosystem in Iran. Eventually, he was appointed director of the Bureau of Wildlife, and he began a weekly television program that introduced viewers to the natural wonders of their country. His TV documentaries made Esmail Carome Iran's best-known naturalist. He took viewers to places like Minneapolis, a 48-kilometer sandy peninsula that's the last stretch of natural coastline along Iran's 800-kilometer Caspian Sea coast. In the early 17th century, Shah Abbas of Persia's Safavid dynasty once killed 90 leopards and 30 tigers there. In 1830, Nasr al-Din Shah of the Qajar dynasty, who had 85 wives, wrote that early one morning he watched millions of migrating birds darken the skies for hours. 50 years later, one of his many sons would take a group of friends to Minneapolis. With newly invented high-powered rifles, they shot 6,000 pheasants, 150 deer, 63 buffalo, 18 leopards, and 35 tigers. And the same prince later described an area outside Shiraz where hundreds of men hunted day and night. The mountains are so rich in wildlife, he wrote in his memoirs, that if the numbers of humans were 10 times over, there would still be enough game animals for everybody. We stayed there for 2 months, and when we were leaving, the number of animals was still the same. Now, statements like these, Carome told his audiences, prove that the Qajar hunters never set out to eradicate entire species of wild animals. In fact, they hoped to hunt forever. They considered natural resources such as wildlife and forests to be renewable resources that simply could not be exterminated by man. But all the species they prized are now rare or threatened or extinct. The mighty lion, the Caspian tiger, the Iranian wild ass, gazelles, bighorn mountain sheep, leopards, and the cheetah. Yes, the cheetah, he says. In his home near Tehran's Islamic Azad University, where he teaches, small Persian rugs cover the hardwood floors. The brick fireplace is flanked by paintings of migrating cranes and the endangered red-breasted goose that winters in Minneapolis. Above the mantel, a 19th century Tabriz tapestry declares in graceful Farsi calligraphy that God is the greatest protector of all. Now, whenever Carome is confronted by someone demanding to know whether it really matters if cheetahs disappear from the face of the earth or if tigers go extinct, he tells them about one particular cheetah. It was where he least expected to encounter one. It was January 2003, and he was visiting America for the first time. A cousin in San Diego had married a school teacher who invited him to observe a 6th grade class. He was charmed that the teacher had brought an Iranian flag and coins to show the students. When she next unrolled an exquisite crimson rug, his eyes widened. That rug, he knew immediately, was a pure silk paisley pattern from the holy city of Qom, worth thousands. Our guest is an ecologist, she told her students. Ecology, she explained, is the science of how everything on Earth, people, plants, animals, fungi, microbes, rocks, soil, water, and air is connected. All over the world, there are people who protect animals and plants so that the connections don't break. Dr. Carome's one of them. There was a knock on the classroom door, and Carome gasped along with the 6th graders as another teacher entered, accompanied by a curator from the San Diego Zoo. The leash he held was attached to a muzzled cheetah. There are 2 populations of cheetah, said the teacher, one in Africa and the other in Asia. The Asiatic cheetah today lives only in Iran, And Carome was amazed that this American woman knew something that he wished his own people comprehended. So what do you think would happen, she said, if Asiatic cheetahs disappeared from the earth? Would it be a disaster? Would we be in trouble? Would you still be able to go to school? Would there still be gasoline for your father's car? Would we have electricity and water? Should we be concerned? The students agreed that this elegant creature, silent on its haunches before them, deserved to live. But none thought that their world would come crashing down along with the cheetahs in the event that it didn't. The teacher turned to the glowing silk rug draped on an easel. This beautiful Persian carpet belongs to an Iranian who lives in San Diego. It's made with more than 1.5 million knots. It took women years to do that. Now suppose some boy with a pair of scissors cuts a few knots from its edge. What'll happen? Nothing. You won't even notice it. Now suppose he returns and makes 200 knots disappear. Probably you still wouldn't notice it among the 1.5 million. But what if he keeps doing it? Soon you'll have a small hole, and it'll get bigger, and eventually nothing will be left of this carpet. Extending her arms, she pointed at the foliage outside and at the cheetah that was watching her as raptly as the students and Carome. All this is the carpet of life. You are sitting on it. Each of those knots represents one plant or animal. They, in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and our groceries, are not manufactured. They are produced by what we call nature. This rug represents that nature. And if something happens in Asia or Africa and a cheetah disappears, that's one knot from the carpet. And if you understand that, you realize that we are all living on a very limited number of species and resources upon which our life depends. Thank you very much.
If you have questions, can you please come to the microphone?
Dan Brown, in his recent book, Inferno, I think did more to popularize the idea of mathematical progression of human population. However, he's wrapped it in Dante's Inferno, where he talks about the levels of purgatory. And his is more figurative, based on history and culture. But do you think that we are headed towards some sort of literal purgatory? And my second question is, what country tops your list as doing the most to be forward-looking into the next centuries?
I haven't read Dan Brown's book yet. The question of whether we're headed towards purgatory, let me put it this way. Every organism in the history of biology, when it exceeds its resource base, suffers a population crash, sometimes fatal to the entire species. Now, we have used brilliant technology to extend our limits, and many economists would have you believe that human ingenuity will keep extending those limits. But I told you of the words of Norman Borlaug, who extended our limits more than anybody else. He said it can't go on, and he knows that the way that he extended the limits on one way has only exacerbated the problem on the other end, because I explained to you about those populations in India and Pakistan and many other places on Earth. You know, we don't really notice the population explosion because we all grew up in it. But it used to be the line was like this, and now the line is like this. We're headed towards 11 billion by the end of this century if we keep growing at this rate, and frankly, I don't think that we can get to it, because the atmosphere is already telling us that things are going to become inhospitable to human life at a certain point, or at least they're going to radically change our coastlines. We're locked into some seacoast change now that there's no way around it, and all the shrill denial that comes out that tries to drown out the facts just simply doesn't have much traction left to it. So I'm not going to make any predictions other than that Homo sapiens is an extraordinarily creative and flexible species, and I would not have bothered writing this book because frankly it took a lot out of me. That travel did not come easy. I wouldn't have bothered doing it if I didn't have hope to think that there is something we can do. And I think that there are things that we can do on every level, starting with being more efficient coming up with better forms of energy, cleaner forms of energy, and also limiting the number of us. This is something that is not onerous. You know, people can have 2 children or fewer and the population will not grow. It'll gradually start coming down to sustainable size. Or if people love the idea of a large family, and God knows most of us really do, you know, one resource that we're not running out of on this planet is children who need a home. Adoption is a wonderful way to have the size family that you choose. And I hope that we all take advantage of everything that we can possibly do. As for countries that I feel that are the most forward-looking, Iran is a mixed bag. But I stated that, you know, that program became the poster child for the United Nations in terms of family planning. There are several other countries who did very different things, but also voluntary. Thailand, a country which actually has a sex industry as one of its economic pillars, is down below replacement rate because they made a national joke out of using condoms. And they, among other things, convinced the sex industry that, you know, you want to have a successful industry, you don't want to be making your clients sick. And it utterly worked through some brilliant advertising. Mexico, the same way. Mexico is now very close to replacement rate. They did it through soap operas, the telenovela. You know, just these episodes on TV that subtly put the message in there that, you know, smaller families seem to do a lot better than bigger ones, and it worked. Next question, sir.
2 quick comments, then 1 question. One comment, I noticed, I used to run tours for adults, and when we went to Quebec province, the Catholic Church was actually handing out condoms in various places in Montreal, which I thought was rather interesting. And in Quebec, they lowered the birth rate from 14 to 2, or a little less than 2, through a natural process of urbanization, plus what I just mentioned. The question that I had was, why do you think, when I'm old enough and I taught in various types of institutions for years, in the 1960s, ZPG, very popular, people had this conversation all the time.
Yeah, that's zero population growth.
Right, it's disappeared. Why? That's my question.
Okay. First of all, I want to respond to your comment. One of the reasons I traveled to so many places is that I wanted to see, is there anything in the religious or cultural history of the world's wide swath of different kinds of cultures and nations, etc., that would accommodate the idea of, so to speak, you know, refraining from embracing so much in a time of need. You know, just like in the Bible, after we had several polygamists, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, trying to fill the earth and multiply, then Joseph, realizing that scarcity was setting in, he has just 1 wife and 2 kids, and he counsels the Israelites and the Pharaoh of Egypt that this is a time to conserve, in which we may be headed into. And I found in many religions the same thing. Catholicism, of course, is tricky. There's a chapter here where I go to the Vatican and have some very interesting questions and some surprising answers. No one handed out condoms there, but it wasn't necessary because it's surrounded, Vatican City is surrounded by Catholic Italy, where some of the most educated per capita women on earth live, and they've made this decision long ago, and their fertility rate is way below replacement because they all have something to do with their lives. Why did ZPG, zero population growth, drop off the map? I think partly because the Green Revolution that I mentioned, a lot of people said, oh wait, there's no problem after all. You know, look, we were saved from the famines. Never mind the fact that Borlaug himself was a member of ZPG. We also, you know, the Limits to Growth was another book that came out a couple years later, and the idea that we were running out of resources prompted a backlash. Oh, we're running out of resources, let's go get them, while the getting is good. And suddenly we had this great global marketplace where everything became a cornucopia. You go into grocery stores and you can get watermelon all year round, even if you live in the frozen north. And the idea of abundance was sold to us in all of the advertising, and we sort of got the idea that really there's not much of a problem. Except since ZPG happened in 1968, our population has more than doubled, and the problem has too. Next question.
How you doing? Hello, you there? That one, okay. Yeah, let me say this, as far as contraceptives, to me, that's not an answer. question. Okay. Far as population, my War II parents raised me, and they said this. My father did. Said, he said, son, keep your pants on. You know, they were married almost 70 years. They're not here anymore, but.
What's your question?
And how many kids did your parents have?
I'm number 5.
Well,
So.
anything over 2 grows the population.
Yeah, so maybe as far as America, we're so industrial. The nation south of us is so unindustrial. All they do is have babies, you know. So
Well, actually, their population growth rate is now below ours, and because we are still growing. You know, I really understand where you're coming from, because it seems like we can do what we've been doing. But the fact is, 40% of the Earth's surface right now is dedicated to growing food for us, either cultivation or grazing. That is not giving much room for these other species upon whose existence ours depends. You know, you go back to Genesis 2, where it tells us to fill the earth and multiply. By Genesis 5, God is already sick of us and our excesses, and he decides to wipe us out. But he and Noah have this discussion, and they decide, okay, we're going to, I'll let you stick around. You can save your family, but what else does he tell Noah? You have to save all the animals. We cannot have a world without them. And we just can't keep growing and pushing everything else off the planet the way we are without running into real trouble. Plus, all that fertilizer and the pesticide that are protecting the plants, that's starting to come back on us big time. The cancer clusters, the autism clusters, I'm not going to go into this stuff right now, but we all know what's happening. We can't spread poison out there and hope that it just picks off the species that we disapprove of.
Yes, sir. I'm regularly asked to donate money to poor charities for improved water extraction, for jobs for men in patriarchal societies, for fertilizers so that they can do better crops. And it sounds like that's not sustainable and in the long run will hurt those countries. And I'm curious, besides education for women, what are some ways that I should direct my charitable dollars to improve the lives of those people in those other countries?
Well, first of all, I don't want anybody who's alive to die. I want everyone to have a long, prosperous life. I just want us to recruit fewer people to replace ourselves. The water shortage thing, let me give you a sense of how critical it is. India saved itself from famine through the Green Revolution, but they dug wells. They were 50 to 75 feet deep. Then they went down to 250, and then 500. I spent a day in the Punjab, the breadbasket of India, interviewing widows of farmers who committed suicide because they could no longer afford to keep digging their wells down to 500 and 1,000 feet deep. Since 1995, 270,000 Indian Green Revolution farmers have committed suicide. I corroborated that figure. And the drug of choice is by drinking pesticide. There's simply not enough water to keep supporting our population. And here in Texas, you guys ought to know that, really.
This is going to be our last question.
Thank you. My question is two-part. One is how much our government spends on the military, and the other is the policy of having economic growth put forward to the public all the time in a world of limited resources. So what can we do to stop our policymakers and leaderships from pushing us down these two paths?
Well, I don't have current figures on military expenditure, but as I mentioned, for what we were spending in a month in Iraq and Afghanistan, we could put that money into helping. One thing I'm very proud of the United States government, we're the biggest provider of contraceptives out there. It started during USAID, which was our response to, Cuba and capitalism, and communism. Give something good that people really want, and people wanted it. Catholic Costa Rica, where we started that, is down below replacement rate, and it used to have the highest population growth rate on the planet. I do deal in an entire chapter here with the economic question. How can we redesign our economy to prosper without depending on constant growth and growth on a planet that does not grow? And ultimately, we are going to have to, because it's resource-based and because of our waste products, such as the exhaust we're sending up into the atmosphere, are starting to become serious limitations on what our future is going to be like. I visit Japan in this book, which now is actually shrinking because of sort of an anomaly. After World War II, they had to cut off their baby boom because they lost the war. Their economy had crashed entirely, and when their soldiers returned home and the population started to grow again, they just couldn't afford it. People were starving. Women were throwing themselves in front of trains. So in 1949, this was before birth control pills, they legalized abortion as an emergency method. And millions of Japanese women partook of that rather than watch another baby die of hunger. So now there's a much smaller baby boom generation replacing that last overgrown generation. And a lot of Japanese economists are freaked out about this, but I spend time with a very visionary Japanese economist who's a member of a major policy institute, who sees that this is inevitably where they have to go and where we are going to have to go to realign ourselves away from heavy, raw resource-based export industries into lighter industries. Japanese young people are starting to move inland as the hinterlands and houses and farms become vacant by this dying off generation. Wages are going to remain high because workers will be fewer and therefore more valuable, but probably as demand drops, as population does, working hours will decrease, and that means that we'll redefine prosperity in part because we're going to have more leisure time and we're going to have more space out there to enjoy it in. Now, there's more to talk about, but time, unfortunately, will not permit it. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Alan will be signing books in the book signing tent right away, and thank you very much for coming.
And we'll be back with more live coverage of the 2013 Texas Book Festival in a few minutes. Here's a look back